full-spectrum barrage jamming, Russian version dedicated with deep respect to the Russian people, whose literature has influenced me throughout my life.
In choosing forms of battlefield electromagnetic jamming, this manual advocates targeted jamming against a specific frequency or channel, and does not advocate barrage jamming across a broad frequency band, because the latter also affects one's own electromagnetic communications and electronic support measures.
From the United States Army Electronic Warfare Manual, 1993, January 5, the Smolensk Front. The fallen city could no longer be seen. In a single night, the front had retreated 40 kilometers.
In the light before dawn, the snowfield showed a cold, dark blue. In every direction far away, struck targets sent up black pillars of smoke. There was almost no wind, and the columns rose straight into the heights like long black gauze threads joining heaven and earth. Following those smoke columns upward, Karina was startled. The sky, just beginning to show morning light, was stuffed with a huge tangle of white, as if a deranged giant had scribbled across it in madness. They were the mingled contrails of fighter aircraft left by the Russian and NATO air forces after a night-long battle for air superiority.
Precision strikes from the air and from distant launch sites had continued all night. To a layperson, they might not have seemed intense, with explosions sounding only every few seconds, sometimes every few minutes. But Karina knew that every explosion meant an important target had been hit, almost never a miss. Each blast was like a flashing punctuation mark in the black essay of the night. When dawn came, Karina did not know how much strength remained in the defense line, or even whether the line still existed. It seemed that in the whole world, only she was resisting.
The electronic countermeasures platoon Major Karina belonged to had been destroyed at midnight when 6 laser-guided bombs fell on its position. Karina escaped by luck. The BMP-2 armored vehicle carrying the jammer was still burning, and the platoon's other electronic warfare vehicles had become scattered heaps of black metal on the snow. The remaining heat in the crater where Karina lay was dissipating, and she felt the cold. She propped herself up with one hand. Her right hand touched something sticky, cold, and soft, like a lump of mud coated in black explosive dust. Then she realized it was a piece of flesh. She did not know what part of a body it had been, much less whose body.
In that fatal strike during the night, 1 lieutenant, 2 second lieutenants, and 8 soldiers had died. Karina vomited, but brought up nothing except sour liquid. She rubbed her hands desperately in the snow, trying to wipe away the blood, but the dark red stains quickly congealed in the cold and remained glaringly visible.
A suffocating dead silence had lasted half an hour, which meant a new ground attack was about to begin. Karina turned up the volume on the radio, clipped to her left shoulder, but only static hissed out. Suddenly, a few blurred words came through, like several indistinct birds flying through a fog.
Observation Post 06 reports. In front of position 1437, 37 M1A2s, average spacing 60 meters. 41 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 500 meters behind the M1A2 attack spearhead. 24 M1A2s and 8 Leclercs are moving around the flank of position 1633, already past the junction with 1437, 1633, 1752. Prepare to engage.
Karina forced down the trembling brought on by cold and fear, steadied the horizon in the field of her binoculars, and saw blurred masses of snow haze rising on the edge of the sky, giving the horizon a furred border.
Then Karina heard the roar of engines behind her. A line of T-90 tanks crossed her position and charged toward the enemy. Behind them, more Russian tanks were crossing the highway embankment. Karina heard another kind of roar. Enemy attack helicopters appeared in the sky ahead, flying in orderly formation and forming a black matrix of dots against the pale dawn. The smoke launchers on the tanks around Karina activated. With a series of low detonations, the position was wrapped in white smoke. Through gaps in the fog, she saw Russian helicopter formations sweeping overhead.
The tank's 125mm guns opened in a storm, and the white fog became a wildly flashing pink curtain of light. Almost at the same moment, the first enemy shells came down, and the pink glow in the fog was replaced by blinding blue-white lightning from explosions. Karina pressed herself to the bottom of the crater. The earth beneath her felt like a vibrating drumhead under the dense thunder, while soil and small stones leapt high beside her and fell across her back. Within the explosions, she could also faintly hear the hiss of anti-tank missiles launching. Karina felt the whole universe shatter in that heart-tearing roar and fall into infinite depths.
Just as her nerves were about to collapse, the tank battle ended. It had lasted only about 30 seconds.
When the white fog and dense smoke cleared, Karina saw the snow before her littered with hit Russian tanks, burning in piles of fierce flame wrapped in black smoke. Looking farther, even without binoculars, she could see a large field of destroyed NATO tanks in the distance, black smoking dots on the snowplain. But more enemy tanks were rushing over the wreckage. They were wrapped in snow mist churned up by their tracks. The flat, broad, ferocious front of the Abrams would emerge from the snow like a vicious turtle breaking through sea waves, and the flashes from its smoothbore gun looked like the shining eyes of the monster.
In the low air, the helicopter melee continued. Karina saw an Apache explode not far away. A Mi-28, leaking fuel, staggered over her head and crashed a few dozen meters away, bursting into a fireball. The wakes of short-range air-to-air missiles drew countless parallel white lines low across the sky.
Karina heard a clang. Turning, she saw the rear bottom hatch of a smoking T-90 open not far away. No one came out, only a hand dangled below the hatch. Karina jumped from the crater, ran behind the tank, grabbed the hand, and pulled. A muffled explosion sounded inside the vehicle. A wave of scorching air drove Karina several steps backward. In her hand she held a hot, soft, sticky mass, a clump of cooked skin torn from the tanker's hand.
Karina looked up and saw flame jet from the bottom hatch. Through the hatch she saw that the inside of the vehicle had become a small inferno. In the transparent, dark red fire, the motionless shapes of the tank crew were clearly visible, wavering as if underwater.
Karina heard two more shrieks. A missile team to her left front had fired its last two anti-tank missiles. One wire-guided Sagar.
Missiles successfully destroyed an Abrams. The other, guided wirelessly, was jammed, shot obliquely upward, and lost its target. Then the 6 men of the missile team abandoned their cover and ran toward Karina's crater. A Comanche helicopter dived at them, its angular body looking like a fierce crocodile. A long row of machine gun bullets struck the snow, throwing up snow and soil like a fence that suddenly rose and quickly collapsed. The fence passed through the small group, knocking down 4 of them. Only a lieutenant and 1 soldier reached the crater.
Only then did Karina notice that the lieutenant wore a tanker's padded helmet, probably from a destroyed tank. Each of them carried an anti-tank rocket launcher. After jumping into the crater, the lieutenant fired first at the nearest enemy tank, hitting the front of the M1A2 and triggering its reactive armor. The explosions of the rocket and the armor fused together in a strange sound. The tank burst out of the smoke, fragments of reactive armor hanging from its front like torn clothing. The young soldier kept aiming at it, the launcher in his hands shaking with the tank's movement, never quite daring to fire. When the tank, now only 40 or 50 meters away, rushed into a low hollow, the soldier had to stand on the edge of the crater and aim down at an angle. His rocket launcher and the Abrams 120mm gun fired at the same time. In panic, the tank gunner had fired a depleted uranium armor, piercing round that would not explode. Traveling at an initial speed of 800 meters per second, the shell struck the soldier and turned his upper body into a bursting spray of blood.
Karina felt fine bits of flesh and blood strike her helmet hard, crackling against it. She opened her eyes and saw, on the crater lip directly before her, the soldier's 2 legs rolling silently down to the crater floor at her feet, like 2 black stumps. The rest of his shattered body had splashed a great radial pattern of red across the snow. The rocket hit the Abrams, and the jet from the shaped charge cut through its armor. Thick smoke rose from the hull, but the steel monster still dragged smoke as it charged them, stopping only about 20 meters away when an explosion inside the hull lifted the top cover of its turret high into the air.
Immediately afterward, the NATO tank line passed around them, and the ground trembled slightly under the heavy impact of the tracks. The tanks paid no attention to the crater where the 2 of them lay. After the first wave rushed past, the lieutenant seized Karina's hand, pulled her from the crater, and brought her to a jeep already riddled with bullet holes. More than 200 meters away, the second armored attack wave was rapidly approaching.
"Lie down and play dead,"
the lieutenant said. Karina lay beside the jeep's wheel and closed her eyes.
Keep your eyes open. It looks more real.
The lieutenant said again, wiping someone else's blood across her face. He lay down too, at a right angle to Karina, his head close against hers. His helmet had rolled aside, and his stiff coarse hair pricked Karina's temple. Karina kept her eyes wide open and stared at the sky, nearly swallowed by smoke.
2 or 3 minutes later, a half-tracked Bradley infantry fighting vehicle stopped a dozen meters from them. Several American soldiers in blue-white snow camouflage jumped down. Most of them went forward in a skirmish line with rifles leveled, but one came toward the jeep. Karina saw 2 paratrooper boots caked with snow dust step close to her face. She could clearly see the emblem of the 82nd Airborne Division on the handle of the dagger fixed to one boot, a Pegasus. The American bent down to look at her. Their eyes met. Karina did everything she could to make her own gaze dull and lifeless as she faced those startled blue pupils.
Oh, God.
Karina heard the exclamation. She did not know whether it was for the beauty of this young woman with a major's star on her shoulder or for the horror of her blood-smeared face. Perhaps it was both. Then he reached out to unbutton her collar. Gooseflesh rose over Karina's body, and she moved her hand a few centimeters toward the pistol at her waist, but the American only tore the identity tag from her neck.
They waited longer than expected. Enemy tanks and armored vehicles streamed past on both sides with a constant roar. Karina felt her body freezing stiff on the snow. At that moment, she unexpectedly remembered 2 lines from a military poem she had once read in an old book about Matrosov.
The soldier lies upon the snow as if he lay on velvet. On the day she received her doctorate, she had copied those 2 lines into her diary. That, too, had been a snowy night. She had stood at a top-floor window of Moscow University's Palace of Science. That night's snow truly had been like velvet, and through the snowy haze the lights of the capital's countless homes appeared and vanished. The next day, she enlisted.
Then a jeep stopped not far from them. 3 NATO officers sat in it smoking cigars and talking. The space around Karina and the lieutenant opened up. They jumped into the jeep. The lieutenant started it and drove fast along the route he had already chosen. Behind them came submachine gun fire. Bullets flew overhead, and one smashed a rearview mirror. The jeep swerved sharply into a burning residential settlement, and the enemy did not pursue them.
Major,
You are a doctor, aren't you?
The lieutenant asked as he drove. Where did you see me? I saw you once with Marshal Levchenko's son. After a moment of silence, the lieutenant said again,
Now his son is the person farthest from the war in the whole world.
What do you mean by that? You should know.
Nothing. Just saying it.
the lieutenant said flatly. Neither of them had their mind on the subject. Both were thinking of the one hope they still held. If only this was the only breach along the whole front. January 5, near solar orbit.
Eternal snowstorm.
Station. Misha felt the loneliness of living alone in a city. Eternal snowstorm.
Was indeed as large as a small city. Its volume equaled that of 2 giant aircraft carriers, and it could support 5,000 people living in space at the same time. When the complex was in rotational gravity mode, it even had a swimming pool and a small river, an unmatched luxury in the working environment of space. But in truth,
Eternal snowstorm was the result of the frugal habits that had marked Russian astronautics since Mir. Its design concept was to combine all functions for space exploration within the solar system into one structure. The one-time investment was huge, but in the long run, it was economical.
Eternal snowstorm was mocked in the West as a Swiss Army knife in space. It could operate as a space station in Earth orbit at many altitudes. It could move easily into lunar orbit or conduct interplanetary exploration flights. Eternal snowstorm
had already flown to Venus and Mars and explored the asteroid belt. With its enormous size, it was equivalent to moving an entire research institute into space. For space science, it had far greater advantages than the West's many small and delicate spacecraft. When Eternal Snowstorm
was preparing to begin its 3-year voyage to Jupiter, the war broke out. At that time, more than 100 crew members all returned to Earth. Most were Air Force officers. Only Misha remained. Then, Eternal Snowstorm
revealed one of its flaws. Militarily, it was too large a target and it had no defensive capability. That the designers had failed to foresee the later militarization of space was a mistake. After the war exploded, Eternal Snowstorm
could only conduct evasive flight. It could not head outward. Inside Jupiter's orbit, there were many NATO unmanned craft, some armed and some unarmed. None of them large, but every one a fatal threat to Eternal Snowstorm. So it could only sail toward near-solar space. Eternal Snowstorm
possessed an active refrigerated heat-shielding system that was its pride, allowing it to approach the sun more closely than any human spacecraft so far. Now,
Eternal Snowstorm
had reached Mercury's orbit, 50 million kilometers from the sun and 100 million kilometers from Earth. Although Eternal Snowstorm
had most of its compartments shut down, the space left to Misha was still astonishingly vast. Through the broad, transparent dome, the sun shone 3 times larger than it appeared from Earth. Solar plages and strange prominences in the purple corona were clearly visible, and at times he could even see the granulation on the photosphere caused by convection. The quiet here was false. Outside, the storms of particle streams and radio waves thrown out by the sun roared, and
Eternal Snowstorm was a tiny seed floating in that turbulent ocean.
A filament, thin beam of radio waves connected Misha to Earth, and also brought him the anxieties of that distant world. He had just learned that the control center outside Moscow had been destroyed by cruise missiles, and that control of Eternal Snowstorm
had been transferred to the second control center at Kuibyshev. Every 5 hours he received a war bulletin from Earth, and each time he thought of his father, January 5, General Staff of the Russian Army.
Marshal Mikhail Semyonovich Levchenko felt as if he were facing a wall. Before him in reality lay a horizontal holographic battlefield map of the Moscow theater. In the past, when he faced a broad paper map hanging on a wall, he had been able to see a vast and deep space. In any case, he still liked traditional maps. He could not remember how many times the location they needed had been at the very bottom of the map, forcing him and his staff to lie on the floor to read it. Thinking of it now made him smile faintly. He remembered, too, the times before exercises when he patched together freshly issued operation maps with transparent tape in a field tent. He had never been good at it, while his son, seeing an exercise with him for the first time, had done it better at once.
Realizing that he had thought of his son again, he stopped himself alertly. Only he and the commander of the Western Group were in the operations room. The latter smoked one cigarette after another. They stared intently at the shifting smoke clouds above the holographic map, as if those clouds were the grave battle situation itself. The commander of the Western Group said,
"NATO's strength along the Smolensk line has reached 75 divisions. The attack frontage is 100 kilometers wide, and there have been breakthroughs at multiple points."
"And the Eastern Front?"
Marshal Levchenko asked. "Most of the 11th Army has also gone over to the right-wing forces, as you know. Their strength is now 24 divisions, but their attack on Yaroslavl is still probing."
An explosion on the surface sent a faint tremor downward. The operations room filled with shadows swaying gently with the ceiling lamps.
"Now, some people are talking about retreating to Moscow and fighting street by street behind the buildings and fortifications on the city's outskirts, as we did more than 70 years ago."
Nonsense. Once we contract from the Western Front, NATO may swing around from the north and join the right-wing forces at Kalinin. Moscow will fall into chaos without a fight. The next operational principle is counterattack first, counterattack second, and counterattack third.
The commander of the Western Group sighed and looked at the map in silence. Marshal Levchenko continued.
"I know the Western Front lacks strength. I am preparing to transfer an army from the Eastern Front to reinforce it."
What? The defense of Yaroslavl is already difficult. Marshal Levchenko smiled.
A mistaken tendency among many commanders now is that they consider matters only from the military angle. The severity of the situation has trapped us inside it. Looking at the present situation, do you really think the right-wing forces lack the strength to take Yaroslavl?
I do not think so. An elite force like the 14th Army, with such dense armor and low-altitude attack power concentrated there, has advanced less than 15 kilometers in a day, despite suffering no great losses. Clearly, they are deliberately slowing down.
Exactly. They are watching. They are watching the battle on the Western Front. If we regain the initiative there, they will keep watching and may even declare a unilateral ceasefire in the East.
The commander of the Western Group held an unlit cigarette he had just taken out and forgot to light it.
The betrayal of several armies on the Eastern Front truly stabbed us in the back, but some commanders have psychologically turned that into an excuse, making our operations passive. That mentality must change. Of course, we must admit that the Moscow theater does not have enough strength to reverse the war fundamentally. Our final hope lies in the reinforcing Caucasus Group and Ural Group.
The nearer Caucasus Group will need at least a week to finish assembling and move into attack positions. Considering air superiority, it may take even longer.
It was past 3 in the afternoon when Karina and the lieutenant drove the jeep into the city. The air raid alarm had just sounded, and the streets were empty. The lieutenant let out a long sigh and said,
Major, I really miss my T-90. 4 years ago, when I graduated from the Armored Academy, I had just lost a girl. But the moment I reached my unit and saw that tank, my mood cleared from overcast to bright. I touched its armor, smooth and warm, like touching a girl's hand.
What was that girl compared to this? This was a man's true companion.
But this morning, it took a west wind hit. Maybe it is still burning now.
At that moment, dense explosions came from the northwest of the city. It was a savage area bombardment, rare in modern air raids. The lieutenant was still immersed in the morning's battle. Less than 30 seconds and an entire tank battalion was gone.
The enemy suffered heavy losses too.
Karina said,
I watched the results. The number of armored targets destroyed on both sides was not very different.
The tank loss exchange ratio was about 1 to 1.2. Helicopters were worse, but not over 1 to 1.4. If so, the battlefield initiative should have been on our side. We have a great numerical advantage. How did the battle become like this?
The lieutenant turned to glance at Karina.
You work in electronic warfare, and you still do not understand. Your toys, the 5th generation C3I, three-dimensional battlefield display, dynamic situation simulation, attack plan optimization, all look impressive in exercises. But in real war, the LCD screen in front of me mostly shows only 2 lines, communication error, and could not log on. Take this morning. I knew nothing about what was happening ahead of me or on either flank. I received one order: engage the enemy. If half as many reinforcements had been committed, the enemy would not have broken through at our position. The whole front is probably like that.
Karina knew that in the battle just past, the total number of tanks both sides had committed across the whole front might have exceeded 10,000, with attack helicopters numbering about half as many.
Their jeep entered Arbut Street. The old pedestrian street was empty now, and sandbags for fortifications were piled before the antique shops and art stores. My steel lover did not die for nothing, the lieutenant said, still unable to free himself from the morning's battle.
I am sure I hit a Challenger, but what I most wanted to hit was an Abrams. Do you know? An Abrams. Then Karina pointed to the doorway of an antique shop. There. My grandfather died there, but this place does not seem to have been hit by an air raid. 20 years ago. I was only 4 then. That winter was so cold. The heating had stopped, ice formed inside the room, and I had to hold the television for warmth while the president in my arms promised Russians a warm winter. I cried that I was cold and hungry. Grandfather watched me silently and finally made up his mind. He took out the medals he had treasured and led me outside. Here. At that time, this was a free market. People sold everything, from vodka to political opinions. An American took a liking to grandfather's medals, but would offer only $40. He said the Order of the Red Banner and the Order of the Red Star were worthless. But if there were an Order of Khmelnytsky, he would pay $100. The Order of Glory, $150.
The Order of Nakhimov, $200. The Order of Ushakov, $250. Of course you cannot have the most valuable victory order. That is only awarded to marshals. But the Order of Suvorov is valuable too. He could pay $450. Grandfather silently walked away. We walked and walked along the cold Arbat. Later grandfather could not go on. It was almost dark. He sat weakly on the steps of that antique shop and told me to go home first. The next day people found him frozen to death there, one hand inside his coat, gripping the medals he had bought with blood, his eyes wide open as he looked at the city he had saved more than 70 years before from Guderian's tank groups.
January 5th, General Staff of the Russian Army.
For the first time in a week, Marshal Levchenko left the underground operations room. He walked through thick snow and searched for the sun, which had already half set behind the snow-laden pine forest. In his imagination, a small black dot was moving slowly across the orange surface of the sunset. That was
Eternal snowstorm, and his son was aborted. He was the son farthest from his father on this planet.
This matter had stirred many rumors inside the country, and abroad the enemy had made full use of it. The New York Times printed a headline in frighteningly large, bold letters, "The furthest deserter in the history of war." Beneath it was Misha's photograph. The caption read, "While the communist government incites 300 million Russians to drown the invaders in blood, the son of their supreme military commander has taken the country's only giant spacecraft and fled 100 million kilometers from the battlefield. He is currently the safest man in the country."
But Marshal Levchenko felt calm. From middle school through postdoctoral work, almost no one around Misha had known who his father was. The Space Control Center had made the decision only because Misha's research specialty was mathematical models of stars and eternal snowstorm.
Approaching the sun was a rare opportunity for his research. The complex could not be flown entirely by remote control. At least one person had to remain aboard. Even the commander-in-chief learned Misha's identity only later from Western news reports.
On the other hand, whether Marshal Levchenko admitted it or not, deep in his heart he truly hoped his son would stay far from war. It was not merely a matter of blood ties. Levchenko always felt that his son did not belong to war. Yes, he was the person in the world least suited to war, yet he also knew there was something wrong with that thought. Who did belong to war?
Besides, did Misha belong to the stars? He loved stars and had devoted his whole life to studying them, but he himself was the opposite of a star. He was more like Pluto, that silent, cold planet moving alone through distant space where worldly light could not reach. Misha's character, together with his pale, delicate appearance, made it easy for people to think he was like a girl. But Marshal Levchenko knew in his heart that his son was in essence not like a girl at all. Girls feared solitude, but Misha loved it. Solitude was his nourishment and his air.
Misha had been born in East Germany. For the Marshal, his son's birthday was the bleakest day of his life. That evening, still only a major, he stood with his men for their last guard duty after more than 40 years at the Soviet War Memorial in West Berlin's Tiergarten. In front of him were smiling Western officers, several slovenly German policemen with wolf dogs arriving to change guard, and skinhead neo-Nazis shouting,
"Red Army, get out!"
Behind him were the tearful eyes of the captain, company commander, and the soldiers. He could not control himself, and let his tears blur it all. After dark, he returned to the emptied camp. On that last night before returning home, he learned that Misha had been born, and that his wife had died in childbirth. Life after returning was difficult. Like 400,000 military personnel and 120,000 civilian employees withdrawn from Europe, he had no housing and lived with Misha in a temporary metal hut, freezing in winter and hot in summer. Former comrades did anything to survive. Some sold weapons to the underworld. Some even stripped in nightclubs.
But he had continued to live uprightly like a soldier. Misha too grew up silently through hardship. Unlike other children, he seemed born able to endure because he had his own world.
Even in primary school, Misha spent every evening quietly alone in his small room. At first, the marshal thought he was reading, but one time he accidentally discovered that his son was standing motionless at the window, looking at the stars.
Papa, I like the stars. I want to look at stars all my life. That was what he told his father.
On his 11th birthday, Misha made the only request he had ever made of his father. He wanted an astronomical telescope. Before that, he had been using Marshal Levchenko's military binoculars to observe the stars. Later, that telescope became Misha's only companion. He could watch the stars from the balcony until the east turned pale. On the few occasions when father and son looked at the stars together from the balcony, the marshal always aimed the telescope at the brightest-looking star in the night sky. But his son would shake his head disapprovingly.
That one is not interesting, Papa. It is Venus. Venus is a planet. I only like stars.
But Misha had no interest in the things other boys liked. The chubby boy next door, son of the Airborne Forces Chief of Staff, once stole his father's pistol to play with it and accidentally shot through his thigh. For the boys of the generals at headquarters, the greatest reward was being taken by their fathers to a military firing range to shoot once. Yet this inborn attachment boys seemed to have toward weapons never appeared in Misha. In that sense, he truly did not seem like a boy.
The marshal was disturbed by this. He could hardly tolerate his son's indifference to weapons, to the point that he later did something that still embarrassed him when he thought of it. Once he quietly placed his Makarov pistol on his son's desk. Not long after returning from school, Misha came out of his room holding the gun. He carried it as a woman might, carefully by the barrel. He placed it gently before his father and said calmly,
"Dad, please don't leave this thing lying around again."
On the question of Misha's future, the marshal was an open-minded man. Unlike the generals around him, he did not single-mindedly want his son, or even his daughters if he had had any, to continue his military career. But Misha was indeed far, far from his father's profession.
Marshal Levchenko was not a hot-tempered man, but as commander of the entire army, he had more than once rebuked a general in front of tens of thousands of officers and soldiers. Yet he had never lost his temper with Misha. This was partly because Misha had always grown silently along his own orbit and rarely worried his father, but more importantly, because Misha seemed born with an extraordinary detachment, a quality that sometimes made Marshal Levchenko feel almost awed. It was as if he had casually buried a seed in a flower box, and it had grown into an incomparably rare plant. With awe, he watched the plant grow day by day, carefully tending it while he waited for it to bloom.
His hopes were not disappointed. His son had now become one of the finest astrophysicists in the world.
By now, the sun had completely set behind the pine forest, and the snow on the ground had changed from white to pale blue. Marshal Levchenko drew back from his thoughts and returned to the underground operations room. Everyone attending the operational meeting had arrived, including the main commanders of the Western Group and Caucasus Group.
There were also more electronic warfare commanders. From major generals down to captains, most of them just returned from the front. A fierce argument was underway in the operations room. The two sides were officers of the Western Group's ground forces and officers of the electronic warfare units.
"We correctly judge the enemy's change in main attack direction,"
said Colonel Filetov, commander of the Taman Motor Rifle Division.
Our armored forces and Army aviation low-altitude attack forces are not lacking in mobility either. But the communication system has been jammed into a complete mess, and the C3I command system is nearly paralyzed. The Army's electronic warfare units were raised from battalion to regiment, from regiment to division, and in the past 2 years, the funding poured into them has exceeded that for conventional equipment. And this is the result?
A lieutenant general commanding theater electronic warfare glanced at Karina beside him. Like the other officers just back from the front, her camouflage uniform was covered with grime and scorch marks, and blood still stained her face. The lieutenant general said,
Major Karina is highly accomplished in electronic warfare research and is also an electronic warfare observer sent to the front by the General Staff. Her view may be more persuasive. Young doctor officers like Karina were mostly frank, fearless, and unguarded. Others often used them as weapons in argument. This time was no exception. Karina stood up and said,
Colonel, you cannot put it that way. Compared with NATO, our investment in C3I over these years has been negligible.
Then what about electronic countermeasures?
The division commander asked.
The enemy can jam us. Why can't you jam them? Our C3I is paralyzed, while NATO's runs smoothly as if it had been oiled. The 1st Marine Division opposite me this morning was able to change its attack direction so quickly. That proves it.
Karina gave a bitter smile. When you mention jamming the enemy, Colonel Feilatov, don't forget that it was on your division's position that your men put guns to the operators' heads and forced the Army electronic countermeasures, jammers, to shut down.
What happened?
Marshal Levchenko asked. Only then did people realize he had entered, and they all rose to salute.
It was like this.
The division commander explained to the marshal.
For our communications command system, their jamming hurt worse than NATO's. Under NATO jamming, we could still maintain some radio communication, but once their jammers switched on, they covered us completely.
Karina said,
But the enemy was completely covered too. This is the only electronic countermeasure strategy currently available to our army. In battlefield communications, NATO now widely uses techniques such as frequency hopping, direct sweep spread spectrum, null steering adaptive antennas, bursts, single frequency forwarding, and frequency agility. Frequency-aimed jamming simply has no effect. We can only use full-spectrum barrage jamming.
A colonel from the 5th Army challenged her.
Major, NATO is using frequency-aimed jamming, and quite narrowband at that, while our C3I system also widely uses the communications technologies you mentioned. Why is their jamming so effective against us?
The reason is simple. What software and hardware platforms is our C3I system built on? Unix, Linux, even Windows 2010. The CPUs are Intel and AMD. That is using dogs raised by someone else to guard your own gate. In this situation, the enemy can quickly master electronic warfare intelligence such as frequency hopping patterns, while also using more and more effective pure software attacks to strengthen the jamming effect. The General Staff once strongly promoted domestic operating systems, but at the lower levels resistance was everywhere. Your army was one of the most stubborn fortresses.
Enough. The problems and contradictions you are discussing are precisely what today's meeting is meant to solve. Meeting begins. Marshal Levchenko cut off the argument.
After everyone sat down before the electronic sand table, Marshal Levchenko called over a major staff officer. The tall, thin young man kept his eyes narrowed, as if he could not adapt to the light in the operations room.
Let me introduce Major Bondarenko. His greatest characteristic is severe myopia. His glasses are unusual. Other people's lenses sit inside the frames, but his lenses sit outside them. As thick as the bottom of a teacup. We cannot see them now. This morning, Major Yang had them smashed when his jeep was caught in an air raid, and it seems he lost his contact lenses too.
Reporting, Chief. That happened 5 days ago in Minsk. My eyes became like this within half a year. If the change had come earlier, I would never have entered Frunz.
The major said, standing at attention, Although no one knew why the Marshal was introducing this, Major, a few low laughs sounded in the crowd.
The facts since the outbreak of war show that despite the defeat on the Belarusian battlefield, in conventional air and ground weapons, we are not much worse than the enemy. But in electronic warfare, the gap is unexpectedly large. There are deep historical reasons for this situation, and that is not what we will discuss today. What we must make clear is this: at present, electronic warfare is the key to our armies regaining the initiative.
First, we must acknowledge the enemy's advantage in electronic warfare, even its overwhelming advantage. Then, based on the electronic warfare hardware and software conditions our army already has, we must formulate an effective set of strategies and tactics. The purpose of this set of strategies and tactics is to create, in a short time, a certain balance of strength between our army and NATO in electronic warfare. Perhaps you think this impossible. Since the end of the last century, our army's theory of war has mainly been based on limited local wars, and has indeed studied too little the comprehensive offensive of an enemy so militarily powerful.
In such a severe situation, we must think in an entirely new way. The new electronic warfare strategy of the Supreme Command that I am about to introduce may be seen as the result of such thinking.
The lights went out. The computer screens and electronic sand tables shut down. Heavy radiation-proof doors closed tight. The operations room was drowned in pitch-black darkness. I ordered the lights turned off. The Marshal's voice came from the darkness.
Time passed slowly in darkness and silence. About a minute went by.
What do you feel now?
Marshal Levchenko asked. No one answered. The thick darkness made the officers seem sunk at the bottom of a night sea, and they felt breathing had become difficult. General Andrei, tell us.
It feels like these past few days on the battlefield,
said the commander of the Fifth Army. Another ripple of low laughter sounded in the dark.
And the others? You probably feel much the same.
The Marshal said, "Of course. Think about it. Nothing in the headset except static, the screen blank, no knowledge of orders or the battlefield situation around you. Isn't it just this feeling? This darkness presses the breath out of you."
But not everyone feels that way. Major Bondarenko, what about you?
Marshal Levchenko asked. Major Bondarenko's voice came from a corner of the operations room. I do not feel as bad as they do. Even when the lights are on, everything around me is blurred.
You even feel a certain superiority, don't you?
Marshal Levchenko asked. Yes, Marshal. You may have heard that during the New York blackout, some blind people led others out of skyscrapers.
But General Andrei's feelings are understandable. He has eagle eyes and is a sharpshooter. When he drinks, he often shoots bottle caps off from more than 10 meters away. Imagine him and Major Bondarenko dueling with pistols at this moment, and it would be quite interesting.
The operations room in darkness fell silent again. The commanders were all thinking. The lights came on. People narrowed their eyes. It was not so much that they could not adapt to the sudden brightness as that they were shocked by the thought the Marshal had just hinted at.
Marshal Levchenko stood and said, "I think I have now made clear our Army's new electronic warfare strategy for the next stage. High-power, full-spectrum barrage jamming. Creating, in electromagnetic communications, a completely dark battlefield shared by both sides."
That will completely paralyze our battlefield command system.
Someone said in alarm. And NATO's as well. Let everyone be blind together, deaf together. Under those conditions, we reach an electronic warfare balance of strength with the enemy. That is the core idea of the new strategy.
Surely you don't mean we will have couriers riding motorcycles to deliver combat orders?
If the roads are bad, they may have to ride horses.
Marshal Levchenko said.
Let us estimate roughly. This kind of full-spectrum barrage jamming can cover at least 70% of NATO's battlefield communications systems, which means their C3I system will be fully paralyzed. At the same time, it can render 50 to 60% of the enemy's long-range strike weapons ineffective. The most obvious example is the Tomahawk cruise missile. The guidance system of current Tomahawks has changed greatly from the last century. Back then, Tomahawks mainly used terrain matching and small altimeter radar for navigation. Now that method is used only for terminal guidance, while most of the range depends on satellite global positioning.
General Dynamics and McDonnell Douglas believe this improvement is a great advance. Americans trust navigation signals from space too much. Once the GPS signal transmission is jammed, Tomahawk becomes blind. This dependence on GPS exists in most NATO long-range strike weapons. Under the battlefield electromagnetic conditions we envision, the enemy will be forced to fight a conventional war with us, allowing us to fully use our advantages.
I still have doubts, said the worried commander of the 12th Army, which was being transferred from the Eastern Front to the Western Front.
Under such battlefield communications conditions, I even doubt my army can move smoothly from the east to the west.
You certainly can.
Marshal Levchenko said. That distance was short for Kutuzov. I refuse to believe today's Russian army cannot cover it without radio. The ones spoiled by modern equipment should be the Americans, not us. I know that when the whole battlefield enters electromagnetic darkness, you will certainly feel fear. At that moment, remember this. The enemy will be 10 times more afraid than you.
As he watched Karina's figure disappear with the group of camouflaged officers through the operations room exit, Marshal Levchenko's heart tightened. She would return to the front, and the electronic warfare unit she belonged to would be where enemy fire was most concentrated. Yesterday, during a conversation with his son 100 million kilometers away, with a round-trip delay of 5 minutes, the Marshal had told him Karina was well. But in the morning's battle, she had nearly failed to return.
Misha and Karina had met during an exercise. That day, the Marshal and his son ate dinner together. As usual, they ate in silence, while Misha's long-dead mother silently watched them from a distant picture frame. Misha suddenly said,
"Papa, I remembered that tomorrow is your 51st birthday. I should give you a birthday present. I thought of it when I saw that astronomical telescope. That gift was truly good."
Give me a few days of your time. His son looked up and quietly watched his father. You have your own career, and I am glad. But surely, it is not excessive for a father to want his son to understand his career. How about you come with me tomorrow to watch a military exercise?
Misha smiled and nodded. He rarely smiled.
This was the largest exercise in the country so far this century. On the night before it began, Misha showed no interest in the torrent of steel rolling along the highway. As soon as he got off the helicopter, he went into the field tent and helped his father tape together the newly issued operation maps. Throughout the exercise the next day, Misha showed no interest at all. Marshal Levchenko had expected that. But one thing gave him great comfort.
The morning exercise was an armored division attacking a height. Misha sat with a group of local officials on the north side of the viewing platform. The platform was at a safe distance, but at the request of those curiosity-seeking local officials, it had been moved much closer than before. 2 22 bombers swept over the height, and heavy aerial bombs fell like rain, turning the hilltop into an erupting crater. Only then did the officials understand the difference between a real battlefield and the movies. In the earth-shaking thunder, all of them covered their heads with both arms and lay across the tables. Several ladies even screamed and tried to crawl under the tables.
But
The Marshal saw that only Misha still sat straight there, still wearing that indifferent expression, quietly and unmoved as he looked at the terrible volcano, allowing the flashes of explosion to blaze in his sunglasses. A warm current surged through Marshal Levchenko's heart. Son, soldier's blood does run in you after all.
That evening, father and son walked across the exercise ground. In the distance, the headlights of armored vehicles scattered like stars across valleys and plains, and a faint smell of smoke lingered in the air.
How much does this exercise cost?
Misha asked. Direct expenses are about 300 million rubles. Misha sighed. Our research group wants to build a third-generation stellar evolution model. We applied for 350,000 in funding and could not get it approved.
Marshal Levchenko said what he had long wanted to say to his son.
The distance between our worlds is too great. Your stars, even the nearest, are 4 light-years away, yes? They truly have nothing to do with armies and wars on Earth. I know little about your work, but I am proud of it. As soldiers, we too are men who most want our sons to understand our profession. What father does not count it as his greatest happiness to tell his son about his life in the army? Yet you have always held a cold attitude toward my profession. In fact, my profession is the foundation and guarantee for yours. In a country without armed forces of sufficient quantity and quality to guarantee peace, pure basic research like yours could not be carried out at all.
Papa, you have it backward. If people all devoted their whole lives to exploring the universe as we do, they would come to perceive the beauty of the universe, the beauty behind its vastness and depth. A person with a deep feeling for the inner beauty of the universe and nature would not go to war.
That idea is childish to the extreme. If war were caused by people's lack of aesthetic feeling, peace would be too easy. Do you think it is so easy for humanity to perceive that beauty? Misha pointed to the brilliant sea of stars in the night sky.
Look at these stars. Everyone knows they are beautiful, but how many can truly understand the deepest layer of that beauty? Countless celestial bodies evolve from nebulae to black holes with such grandeur. The energy they erupt is so vast and violent. But do you know that only a small number of elegant equations can describe all this precisely? Mathematical models built from those equations can predict every behavior of stars with extraordinary accuracy. Even our mathematical models of the atmosphere on our own planet are less accurate by several orders of magnitude.
Marshal Levchenko nodded. That may be true. They say humanity understands the moon better than the seabed of Earth, but the feeling for the deep beauty of the universe and nature you speak of still cannot stop war. No one felt that beauty more than Einstein. Yet, the atomic bomb was still built on his recommendation.
Einstein achieved little in his later research, largely because he became too involved in politics. I will not repeat his path. But, Papa, when the need comes, I too will do my duty.
Misha stayed in the exercise area for 5 days. The Marshal did not know when his son met Karina. By the first time he saw them together, they were already talking easily. They talked about stars, and Karina knew a great deal about them. Seeing Karina, still an innocent young woman, carrying a major's star so early because of her doctorate, made him feel somewhat awkward. But apart from that, he had a good impression of her. The second time he saw Misha and Karina together, Marshal Levchenko saw some intimacy between them. The content of their conversation surprised him. They were talking about electronic warfare.
At that time, the two of them were beside a tank not far from the Marshal's jeep. Because of the subject, they did not bother to avoid others. The marshal heard Misha say,
"You are now focused only on high-level, pure software things like C3I, virus attacks, digital battlefields, and so on. But have you thought that you may be holding a sword made of wood?"
Seeing Karina's astonished gaze, Misha continued.
Have you thought about the foundation of these things, that is, the physical layer at the very bottom of the 7-layer network protocol? Civilian networks can use media such as optical fiber and directed laser beams. Upper battlefield C3I systems, the terminals move quickly and their positions are uncertain, so information links must mainly depend on what may.
The marshal was truly astonished. He had never exchanged these ideas with his son, and Misha could not possibly have read his secret documents. Yet he had concisely and accurately expressed thoughts the marshal had formed over many years in electronic warfare. Misha's words influenced Karina even more deeply. They actually diverted her from her original research direction and led her to develop an electromagnetic jamming device code named
Flood. The Flood was small enough to fit into an armored vehicle and could emit intense electromagnetic jamming waves simultaneously from 3 kilohertz to 30 gigahertz, covering every electromagnetic communications band except millimeter wave. Its first test at a base in Siberia brought the Army a pile of lawsuits.
Flood cut off all electromagnetic communications in the nearby city. Cell phones failed, pagers stopped ringing, televisions and radios received no signal, and the effect on banks and stock markets was catastrophic. Local authorities claimed astronomical losses. Flood
was inspired by a type of electromagnetic bomb. That weapon used high explosive to produce a powerful electromagnetic pulse in a disposable coil. Therefore, Flood
worked like a rocket engine, and the sound it produced shattered nearby window glass. That determined that it could only be operated remotely, and the operators 2 or 3 kilometers away still had to wear protective suits against microwave radiation. Flood
caused great controversy in the General Armaments Department and the General Staff's Electronic Warfare Command agencies. Many believed it had no practical combat value, and that using it on a limited battlefield was like using nuclear weapons in street fighting, causing equal damage to enemy and self. But at the Marshal's insistence,
Flood was mass-produced in more than 200 units. Now, in the Supreme Command's new electronic warfare strategy, it would play the main role.
That his son had fallen in love with a girl in the army surprised the marshal deeply. His conclusion was that Misha's feeling for Karina had nothing to do with her profession. Later, Misha brought Karina home several times. The first time, Karina wore a bright dress. As she was leaving, the marshal heard Misha say to her,
"Wear your uniform next time." This made the marshal overturn his earlier conclusion. He now knew that Misha's love for Karina was not entirely unrelated to her being a major. Again he felt what he had felt on the morning of the first exercise day. The major's star on Karina's shoulder now seemed incomparably beautiful to him too.
January 6th, Moscow Theater.
Powerful electromagnetic waves quickly gathered above the theater and finally formed a vast electromagnetic typhoon. After the war, people recalled that even in mountain villages far from the front, animals and birds became restless. In blacked-out cities, people could see tiny sparks induced on television antennas.
An armored regiment of the 12th Army, transferred from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, was marching rapidly. The regimental commander stood beside a jeep parked by the road, watching with satisfaction as his troops hurried forward amid snow dust. Enemy air raids were far less intense than expected, so the troops could travel by day. Then 3 Tomahawk missiles skimmed low overhead.
the deep hum of their ramjets clearly audible. Soon 3 explosions sounded in the distance.
The signalman beside the commander had nothing to do but hold a headset full of static. He turned to look toward the explosions, then cried out and told the commander to look. The commander told him not to make a fuss, but a major battalion commander nearby also told him to look. So he looked, then shook his head in confusion. Not every tomahawk hit its target, but it was rare indeed for 3 missiles to fall thousands of meters apart into empty fields.
2 Su-27s flew alone at 5,000 meters over the theater. They had belonged to a fighter squadron, but the squadron had just fought an encounter battle over the sea with a NATO F-22 squadron, and in the aerial melee they had become separated from their own unit. In the past, regrouping would have been easy. Now radio contact was impossible. Airspace that had once seemed narrow for high-speed fighters now felt as vast as the universe, and finding each other was like fishing a needle from the sea. The lead and wing aircraft had to fly almost touching, close as aerobatic performers, because only that way could they hear each other's radio calls.
Suspicious target, upper left, bearing 220, elevation 30.
The wingman reported. The lead pilot looked along that bearing. The winter sky after snow was clean and blue, with excellent visibility. The 2 aircraft climbed obliquely toward the target to observe it. The target was flying in the same direction, but much more slowly, so they soon caught up.
When they saw its shape clearly, they truly felt as if they had seen a ghost in daylight. It was a NATO E-4A airborne early warning aircraft. The enemy aircraft a fighter was least likely to meet, as impossible as a person seeing the back of his own head. The E-4A's radar surveillance area reached 1 million square kilometers. A full sweep took only 5 seconds. It could discover targets 2,000 kilometers from the defended zone and provide more than 40 minutes of warning. It could detect 800 to 1,000 electromagnetic signals within a range of 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers. And each scan could interrogate and identify 2,000 targets of every kind on land, sea, and in the air.
AWACS aircraft never needed escort. Their powerful thousand-eye eyes allowed them to avoid fighter threats from far away. So the lead pilot naturally thought this might be a trap. He and the wingman carefully searched the surrounding airspace. In the clear, cold sky, there was nothing. The lead pilot decided to take the risk.
Thunderball, Thunderball, I am beginning the attack. Guard bearing 317, but do not go beyond visual range.
After watching the wingman fly toward the direction where he thought an ambush most likely, he lit afterburner and pulled hard on the stick. The Su-27 trailed accelerated black smoke and lunged obliquely upward at the early warning aircraft, like a cobra rearing its head. The E-4A also detected the threat approaching it and hurriedly began an escape maneuver to the southeast. Magnesium flares against heat-seeking missiles kept popping from its tail, a little string of light balls like a soul frightened out of its shell. Before a fighter, an early warning aircraft was like a bicycle before a motorcycle. It could not escape. Only then did the lead pilot feel how selfish his order to the wingman had been.
He followed far above and behind the E-4A, savoring the prey already in hand. The blue-white radar dome on the E-4A's back had elegant lines, like a delightful Christmas toy. Its thick white fuselage was like a plump stewed duck on a platter, making him hungry and yet reluctant to use knife and fork. But instinct told him not to delay. He first fired a short burst from the 20mm cannon, shattering the radar dome. He saw fragments of the Westinghouse AN-Pi3 radar antenna scatter through the air like silver paper flowers at Christmas.
Then he cut off one wing of the E-4A with cannon fire. Finally, the twin-barreled cannon,
firing at 6,000 rounds per minute, lashed its whip of death across the tumbling, falling E4A and cut it in two. The J-10 followed the two falling sections along a descending spiral. The pilot saw people and equipment tumbling constantly from the cabin, like candy spilling from a box, and several parachute flowers blooming in the air. He remembered a comrade shot down in the recent air battle. An F-22 had passed 3 times over the comrade's parachute, flipping it over, and he had watched his comrade vanish slowly like a stone against the white background of the earth.
He restrained the impulse to do the same. After rejoining the wingman, the two aircraft left the airspace at maximum speed. They still felt it might be a trap. Those two were not the only aircraft that had lost their way. Over the Langfang front, a Comanche,
belonging to the U.S. Army 1st Cavalry Division, flew aimlessly. Its pilot, Lieutenant Walker, however, was deeply excited. He had only recently transferred from the Apache to the Comanche,
and was not yet used to this attack helicopter, which had only been equipped in large numbers by the Army at the end of the last century. He was uncomfortable with the Comanche's foot-pedalless control system, and felt its binocular helmet sight was less comfortable than the Apache's.
monocular sight. But what he was least used to was Captain Honey, the attack commander sitting in front. When they first met, Honey said,
"Lieutenant, you must understand your position. I am the brain of this helicopter. You are merely one of its electronic and mechanical components. You must fulfill a component's duty."
Walker hated existing as a component. He remembered a nearly 100-year-old former naval aviator from World War II visiting their base. The old man looked at the Comanche cockpit, shook his head, and said,
"Ah, boys, the cockpit of my old Mustang had fewer instruments than a microwave oven today. My best instrument was this." He patted Walker's backside. "The difference between our two generations of pilots is the difference between an aerial knight and a computer operator."
Walker wanted to be an aerial knight, and now his chance had come. Under the Russians' almost pathological, insane jamming, this helicopter's integrated mission equipment system, its target detection system, its aided target detection and classification system, its real scene vision generator,
and its data burst system.
and all the rest had all damned well gone into shock. Only the two 1,200 horsepower T-800 engines still turned faithfully. Honey normally lived entirely by those electronic toys, and now his filthy, chattering mouth had gone silent along with them. Then Walker heard Honey's voice through the intercom.
"Attention. Target sighted. Seems to be forward left. Seems to be beside that small hill. There is an armored unit. Seems to be enemy. You handle it." Walker almost laughed aloud. "Huh. This kid. Listen to how he used to command."
Target detected, bearing 13317 Type 90 tanks, 21 Type 89 personnel carriers, moving on bearing 391 at an average speed of 43.5 kilometers per hour, average interval 31.4 meters. Execute optimized attack plan, AJ041. Enter from bearing 179 at a 37-degree angle.
And now, seems there is an armored unit. Seems to be.
Behind the hill.
As if I needed you to tell me that. I saw it long ago. And you tell me to handle it. You are useless now, Honey. This is my world. I am going to use my backside as an instrument and become a knight. This Comanche in my hands will not disgrace the name of that brave Indian tribe. Comanche.
Charged toward the obvious target and fired all 62 of its 2.75-inch hydro rockets. Walker watched in rapture as his swarm of little bees, each dragging a fiery tail, flew happily toward the target and drowned the enemy convoy in a sea of fire. But when he circled to observe the result, he realized something was wrong. The enemy soldiers on the ground were not taking cover. They all stood in the snow, pointing at him as if cursing. Walker flew closer and clearly saw the marking on one destroyed armored vehicle. 3 concentric rings, blue in the center, then a white ring, and a red ring.
Walker's vision went black. He felt the world had become hell, and he began cursing too. "You blind son of a bitch idiot. Are you blind?" But he was smart enough to fly far away in case the enraged Frenchman fired back.
You son of a bitch. You are probably thinking now how to push the responsibility onto me at a court-martial. You will not get away with it. You are responsible for target identification. You had better understand that.
Maybe we still have a chance to make it right, Honey said timidly.
I have found another unit just across there.
Go to hell, Walker said irritably. This time, I am sure, they are exchanging fire with the French. That restored Walker's spirits. He flew toward the new target and saw that the opposing side was mainly infantry, with little armor, which did confirm Honey's judgment. Walker fired his last 4 Hellfire.
Missiles then set the Gatling twin-barrel machine gun to 1,500 rounds per minute and began firing. He pleasantly felt the slight vibration transmitted through the airframe by the gun and saw the enemy skirmish line on the ground dusted with a layer of white.
Pepper. But the instinct of a seasoned attack helicopter pilot told him danger was near. He turned his head and saw a shoulder-fired missile just launching from the shoulder of a soldier standing on a jeep down to the left. Walker frantically fired magnesium decoy flares and maneuvered away to the rear, but it was a little too late. The missile, trailing spider silk white smoke, struck the underside of the
Comanches.
Nose. When Walker woke from the brief dizziness caused by the explosion, he found the helicopter had crashed into the snow. Walker desperately crawled out of the cabin full of white smoke and hugged a tree that had just been cut in half by the rotor. Looking back, he saw Captain Honey in the front cockpit blasted into pulp. Ahead, a group of soldiers carrying submachine guns were running toward him. Trembling, Walker took out his pistol and placed it on the snow before him, then pulled out a Russian phrasebook and began reading.
I has put down no rise, I is war captive, Geneva.
He took a rifle butt to the back of his head and a kick in the stomach. But as he rolled over in the snow, he burst into laughter. He might be beaten half to death, but not all the way dead. He had seen the eagle collar badges of the Polish army on the soldiers' collars.
January 7th, Minsk. NATO Operational Command Center.
Call that damn doctor here!
General Tony Parker shouted irritably. When the thin Colonel Doctor ran up to him, he said angrily,
"What is going on? You have worked on it twice and my dentures are still buzzing."
"General, this is the strangest thing I have ever seen. Perhaps there is a problem with your nervous system. Shall I give you a local anesthetic?" At that moment, a major staff officer came over and said, "General, please give me your dentures. I have a way."
So Parker took out his dentures and placed them on the tissue the major handed him.
The media's common story about the general's 2 missing front teeth was that they had been knocked out when his tank was hit during the Gulf War. Only the general himself knew that was not true. That time his lower jaw had been broken. The teeth had been lost earlier. It was at Clark Air Base. At the time it seemed the world contained nothing but volcanic ash. The sky was gray, the ground was gray, the air was gray, and even the
Hercules aircraft that he and the last personnel from the base were about to board had a thick white layer on its roof. The dark red light of lava flickered deep inside the gray. The Filipina employee had still come to find him, saying the base was gone, she had lost her job, the house was buried under volcanic ash, and how were she and the child in her belly to live? She pulled at him and begged him to take her to America. He told her it was impossible, so she took off a high heel and struck him in the face, knocking out his 2 front teeth. Looking at the gray sea, Parker silently thought, "My child, where are you now? Are you living with your mother in the slums of Manila?"
In a sense, your father is fighting for you now. After the war, when Russia's democratic government comes to power, NATO's vanguard will reach China's border. Subic and Clark will again become America's naval and air bases in the Pacific, more prosperous than in the last century, and you will find work there. If you are a girl, perhaps you will meet an American officer the way your mother did. What was her name again? Ah, Elena. Most importantly, under NATO pressure, the Chinese may give you what you have long wanted, those beautiful islands in the South China Sea.
I once saw them from the air, white coral surrounding brown sand, like pairs of eyes on the blue sea. Child, those are your father's eyes.
The major who had repaired the dentures returned, interrupting the general's wandering thoughts. The general picked up the dentures from the tissue, put them in, felt them for a few seconds, and looked at the major in surprise. How did you do that?
General, your dentures were buzzing because they were resonating with electromagnetic waves. The general stared at the major, plainly not believing him.
General, it really is so. Perhaps you have been exposed to powerful electromagnetic waves before, for example within radar illumination. But those wave frequencies did not match the natural frequency of your dentures. Now electromagnetic waves across all frequency bands in the air are very strong, so this happened. I modified the dentures, raising their resonance frequency a great deal. They are still resonating now, but you cannot feel it.
After the major left, General Parker's gaze fell on a clock beside the electronic operations map. Its base was a statue of Hannibal riding an elephant, engraved with the words, "War must win."
It had originally stood in the White House Blue Room. When the president noticed that Parker's gaze always fell on the thing, he personally picked up the clock that had been there for more than a century and gave it to him. God bless America, General. Now you are God.
Parker pondered for a long time, then said slowly,
"Order a halt to the offensive along the entire line. Use all air power to search for and destroy the Russian jamming sources."
January 8th. General Staff of the Russian Army. The enemy has stopped attacking. You do not seem happy. Marshal Levchenko said to the commander of the Western Group, who had just returned from the front.
It is hard to be happy. NATO's entire air power is now concentrated on striking our jamming units. These strikes have indeed been effective.
This was within our expectations.
Marshal Levchenko said calmly.
Our tactics made the enemy helpless at first, but they were bound to find a way to counter them. Jammers used for barrage jamming, because of their intense full-spectrum transmissions, are easy to detect and destroy. Fortunately, we have gained considerable time. Now all hope rests on the rapid assembly of the two groups.
"The situation may be more severe than expected,"
said the commander of the Western Group.
Before we lose the electronic warfare advantage, we may not have left enough time for the Caucasus Group to move into attack positions.
After the commander of the Western Group left, Marshal Levchenko looked at the front terrain on the electronic sand table and thought of Karina under dense enemy fire. From that, he thought again of Misha. That day, Misha had come home with bruises on his face. Before that, the Marshal had heard rumors that his son was the only anti-war person at his university, and had been beaten by the students for it.
I only said we should not speak lightly of war. Can we truly not reach a rational peace with the West?
Misha explained to his father. The Marshal said to his son with a severity he had never used before.
You know your position. You may remain silent, but from now on such words and actions are absolutely forbidden.
Misha nodded. When the Marshal came home that evening, he told Misha at once, "The Russian Communist Party has taken power." Misha glanced at his father and said calmly,
"Let us eat."
After that, when the West declared Russia's new government illegal, and when Dubelev organized the extreme right alliance and launched the Civil War, Marshal Levchenko no longer needed to tell Misha. Father and son ate dinner silently every night, as before. Until one day, Misha received notice from the space base, packed his luggage, and left. 2 days later, he rode the shuttle up to the Brone.
Eternal snowstorm in low Earth orbit. Another week passed, and total war broke out. A world war launched by an unprecedentedly powerful enemy from an unexpected direction, intended to thoroughly dismember Russia. January 9, near solar orbit.
Eternal snowstorm.
Passes Mercury, because eternal snowstorm.
Was moving very fast. It could not become a satellite of Mercury. It could only sweep at high speed over the side of the planet facing the sun. This was the first time humanity had directly observed Mercury's surface at close range with the naked eye. Misha saw cliffs 2 kilometers high, winding for hundreds of kilometers across plains, covered with huge craters. He also saw a basin planetary geologists called
Strange terrain,
Named
Caloris, with a diameter of 1,300 kilometers. Its strangeness lay in the fact that on Mercury's opposite side, there was a basin of similar area directly facing it. People guessed that a huge comet had struck Mercury, and the powerful shock waves had passed through the entire planet, forming 2 extremely similar basins in the 2 hemispheres at the same time. Misha also discovered many new and exciting things. He found many bright spots on Mercury's surface, and when he enlarged them on the screen, he held his breath with excitement.
They were lakes of mercury on Mercury, each averaging more than 1,000 square kilometers in area.
Misha imagined standing on the shore of a Mercury lake. During Mercury's long day, under the fierce heat of 1,800 degrees Celsius. Even in strong wind, a Mercury lake would be very calm, and Mercury had no atmosphere, no wind. The lake's surface would be like a vast mirror plane, reflecting the sun and the Milky Way without distortion.
Eternal snowstorm.
Would continue approaching the sun after passing Mercury, sailing until it reached the limiting distance tolerated by its insulating layer, which was supported by nuclear fusion refrigeration equipment. The sun's high temperature would be its best cover. No NATO spacecraft could fly into that blazing hell.
Looking at this vast universe, and then thinking of the war on the mother planet 100 million kilometers away, Misha once again lamented the narrowness of humanity's gaze. January 10, the Smolensk front.
Watching the enemy skirmish line gradually approach, Karina understood why this point alone had survived after the surrounding jamming sites had been destroyed, one after another. The enemy wanted to capture an intact flood unit, the helicopter group made up of 3 Comanches and 4 Black Hawks.
Had easily discovered the position of this flood. Because flood emitted such enormous electromagnetic power, it could be remotely controlled only through optical cable. This let the enemy follow the cable and discover Karina's remote control station 3,000 meters from the flood.
Unit. It was an isolated, abandoned storehouse. The 4 Black Hawks,
carrying more than 40 enemy infantry, landed less than 200 meters from the storehouse. At that time, besides Karina, there were a captain and a sergeant in the remote control station. Hearing the engines, the sergeant had just opened the storehouse door when a helicopter sniper's bullet lifted off his skull. The enemy's following fire was cautious and restrained, clearly because they feared damaging the equipment inside that they wanted to obtain. That allowed Karina and the captain to hold out longer.
Now, to Karina's left front, the captain's submachine gun had gone silent. Its sound had been her only comfort. She saw that behind the tree stump used as cover, the captain's body lay motionless, while a ring of deep red blood spread across the snow around him. Karina was behind a simple cover made of several sandbags in front of the storehouse. 8 submachine gun magazines lay scattered at her feet, and the hot barrel hissed in the snow piled on top of the sandbags. Whenever Karina fired, the enemy opposite would drop, bullets throwing up clumps of snow before them, while enemies on the other side of the semicircular encirclement would leap up and advance quickly for a distance.
Karina now had only 3 magazines left. She began firing single shots, an inexperienced action that told the enemy she was low on ammunition and made them advance faster and more boldly. When Karina changed magazines again, she heard the thick snow atop the sandbags squeak, and something burrowed through it quickly. She felt something shove hard into her right ribs. There was no pain, only numbness spreading rapidly. She felt warm blood running down the right side of her body. She held on and fired the magazine almost blindly to the end.
When she reached for the last magazine on the sandbags, a bullet broke her forearm. The magazine fell into the snow, leaving her arm swinging back and forth, attached only by a strip of skin. Karina stood, turned, and walked toward the storehouse door. Behind her, a thin trail of blood marked the snow. As she pulled the door open, another bullet pierced her left shoulder.
A small detachment of U.S. Marine Corps SEAL.
Commandos led by Captain Rhett Donaldson cautiously approached the storehouse. When Donaldson and 2 Marines stepped over the Russian sergeant's body, kicked open the door, and burst into the shelter, they found only one young female officer inside. She sat beside their target, the flood.
Remote control instrument, one broken arm hanging weakly over the control console. Facing her reflection in the display screen, she used the other hand to arrange her hair, blood dripping steadily pooled in a small puddle at her feet. She smiled at the Americans and the row of gun muzzles as if in greeting. Donaldson let out a long breath, but that breath never came back in. He saw the hand arranging her hair lift a dark green elongated object from the controller and suspend it in the air. Donaldson recognized it at once as a fuel-air bomb. Because it was equipped for attack helicopters, it was very small.
The thing was detonated by a laser proximity fuse. 1/2 meter above the ground, it would explode twice, first dispersing gaseous explosive, then igniting the explosive mist. Even if he were an arrow,
He could not fly out of its lethal radius now.
He extended one hand toward her and pressed it downward. Calm down, Major. Calm down. Do not get excited. He gestured around him, and the Marines lowered their muzzles.
Listen to me. This is not as serious as you think. You will receive the best medical care. You will be sent to the best hospital in Germany, and then you will be among the first prisoners exchanged. The Major smiled at him again, which encouraged him somewhat.
There is no need at all for you to use such a barbaric method. This is a civilized war. It was supposed to go smoothly. I felt that 20 days ago when we crossed the Polish-Russian border, most of your firepower had already been destroyed, and only scattered machine gun fire ornamented this glorious and romantic expedition just right. You see, everything will go smoothly. There is no need.
I know another beginning that was even more beautiful.
The Major said in pure English. Her gentle voice seemed to come from heaven. It could make flame go out and steel soften.
Beautiful beaches, palm trees, welcome banners hanging from them. Pretty girls everywhere, with hair down to their waists, wearing silk trousers that rustled as they moved among the young soldiers, decorating them with red and pink garlands, and smiling shyly at the stunned men. Captain, do you know this landing?
Donaldson shook his head in confusion. That was 9 o'clock in the morning on March 8, 1965, at Da Nang, when the first U.S. Marines landed on Vietnamese soil. It was also the beginning of the Vietnam War.
Donaldson felt as if he had fallen into an ice pit. The calm he had just held vanished in an instant. His breathing grew rapid and his voice began to tremble. "No, don't do this, Major. It is unfair for you to treat us this way. We have not killed many people. The killers are them,"
he said, pointing to the helicopter hovering outside the window.
Those pilots and those gentlemen on distant aircraft carriers operating computers to guide cruise missiles. But they are all decent gentlemen, too. The targets they face are pretty colored marks on screens. They press a button or move a mouse, wait patiently for a while, and those marks disappear. They are civilized gentlemen. They bear no malice, truly no malice. Are you listening to me?
The Major smiled and nodded. Who said death was ugly and terrifying? Death was beautiful. I have a girlfriend. She is studying for a doctorate at the University of Maryland. She is as beautiful as you truly. She even takes part in anti-war marches. I should have listened to her, Donaldson thought.
"Are you listening to me? Say something too. Please, say something." The beautiful Major smiled at the enemy one last time. "Captain, I am doing my duty." A unit of the Russian 104th Motor Rifle Division rushing to reinforce them was still half a kilometer from the flood.
Remote control station when they first heard a muffled explosion and saw from far away the isolated little storehouse in the open field disappear into a mass of white fog. Then came a roar 100 times louder than the first. The ground shook. A huge fireball appeared where the storehouse had stood. Wrapped in black smoke, flame rose high and turned into a towering mushroom cloud, like an incomparably beautiful flower of life blooming between heaven and earth.
January 11th. General Staff of the Russian Army. I know what you want. Don't waste words. Ask for it. Marshal Levchenko said to the commander of the Caucasus Group, "I want the battlefield electromagnetic conditions of the past 2 days to continue for 4 more days."
You know that 70% of our battlefield jamming units have now been destroyed. I cannot give you 4 hours. then my group cannot reach attack position on time. NATO air strikes have greatly slowed the speed of assembly.
If that is so, put a bullet into your own head. The enemy has now approached Moscow. They have reached the position Guderian reached 70 years ago. On his way out of the underground operations room, the commander of the Caucasus group silently repeated in his heart, "Moscow, hold on."
January 12th, Moscow Defense Line. Colonel Filetov, commander of the Taman Division, knew their position could withstand at most one more attack.
Enemy air and long-range strikes were growing fiercer, while Russian air cover was dwindling. The division had little armor or attack helicopter strength left. This last stand depended almost entirely on flesh and blood.
The division commander dragged his leg, severed by shrapnel, and walked out of the shelter using a rifle as a crutch. He saw that the trenches had not been dug deep. It was understandable. Most of the men on the position were wounded now. But to his surprise, in front of the trenches they had built a neat breastwork about half a meter high. The commander wondered what material could have been used to build it so quickly. He saw several branch-like things protruding from the snow-covered wall. When he came closer, he saw they were pale, rigid arms. Furious, he seized a colonel regimental commander by the collar.
"Bastard! Who told you to build cover out of soldiers' corpses? I ordered it." The division chief of staff's voice sounded calmly from behind him. "We moved into the new position too quickly last night, and this is all farmland. There was truly no other material."
They stared at each other in silence. Blood flowing from the bandage on the chief of staff's forehead had frozen in streaks across his face. After a while, the two of them walked slowly along the trench, along this breastwork built from youth and life. The division commander's left hand leaned on the rifle used as a crutch. With his right hand, he straightened his helmet and saluted the breastwork. They were inspecting their troops for the last time. They passed a small soldier whose legs had been blown off. Blood from the severed legs had mixed the snow and soil beneath him into red-black mud, whose surface had now frozen again. He lay there, placing an anti-tank grenade against his chest. Raising a bloodless face, he smiled at the division commander.
"I am going to stuff this thing into an Abrams track." The cold wind whipped up streams of snow mist and howled bitterly, as if playing an ancient war song.
"If I die before you, build me into this wall too. It is indeed a good resting place,"
the division commander said.
"The two of us will not be far apart in time."
The chief of staff said with his characteristic calm, January 12, General Staff of the Russian Army. A staff officer came to tell Marshal Levchenko that the Minister of Space urgently wanted to see him. The matter was critical and concerned Misha and electronic warfare.
Hearing his son's name, Marshal Levchenko's heart shook. He had already learned of Karina's death, and at the same time he could not imagine what relation Misha, 100 million kilometers away, could have to electronic warfare. He could not even imagine what relation Misha had now to Earth.
The minister and his party entered. Without saying much, he handed a 3-inch optical disc to Marshal Levchenko.
"General, this is the message we received an hour ago from Misha aboard Eternal Snowstorm." Later, he added that this was not a private message, and hoped you would play it before all concerned personnel. Everyone in the operations room listened to the voice from 100 million kilometers away.
"From the war news I have received, I learned that if electromagnetic jamming cannot continue for another 3 to 4 days, we may lose this war. If that is true, Papa, I can give you that time."
Before, you always believed the stars I study were too far from reality. I believed so too, Now it seems we were both wrong. I remember telling you that although the energy produced by a star is enormous, the star itself is a relatively pure and simple system. Our Sun, for example, consists of only the two simplest elements, hydrogen and helium. Its operation is formed by only two mechanisms, nuclear fusion and gravitational equilibrium. Thus, compared with our Earth, its state of operation is easier to grasp mathematically. And now, extremely precise mathematical models of the Sun have been established, and some of that work is mine.
Through this mathematical model, we can predict the Sun's behavior with very high accuracy. That allows us to use a tiny disturbance to locally break a certain equilibrium in the Sun's operation within a short time. The method is simple. Use eternal snowstorm to strike a precisely calculated point on the Sun's surface.
Perhaps you think this is nothing more than throwing a pebble into the sea. But that is not so, Papa. It is a grain of sand falling into an eye.
From the mathematical model, we know that the Sun is an extremely delicate and sensitive energy balance system. If the calculation is correct, a tiny disturbance can produce chain reactions on the solar surface and at considerable depth. As this reaction spreads, it will break the local equilibrium.
There are historical precedents. The most recent recorded one occurred in early August 1972, when a violent eruption took place in a very small region of the solar surface. That eruption caused an electromagnetic storm with enormous effects on Earth. Compass needles on aircraft and ships jumped wildly. Long-distance radio communications were interrupted. Dazzling red light flashed in the night sky over the Arctic, and in the countryside electric lamps flickered on and off as if at the center of a thunderstorm. The effect lasted more than a week. A more credible current explanation is that a celestial body smaller than eternal snowstorms struck the solar surface at that time.
Such disturbances of the Sun's surface equilibrium must have happened many times in history. But most occurred before humanity invented radio receivers, so they went unnoticed. Those impacts on the Sun were random accidents, so the balance disturbances they produced were limited in intensity and scope.
But eternal snowstorm's impact point on the Sun has been precisely calculated. The disturbance it produces will be several orders of magnitude larger than the natural disturbances mentioned above. This disturbance will cause the Sun to erupt intense electromagnetic radiation into space, including electromagnetic waves in all bands from extremely low frequency to very high frequency. At the same time, the intense X-rays emitted by the Sun will violently strike the ionosphere, which is crucial to shortwave communications, changing its properties and cutting communications. When the disturbance occurs, almost all radio communications on Earth's surface, except millimeter wave, will be interrupted. The effect may be relatively weaker at night, but in daylight it may exceed the electromagnetic jamming you conducted over the past 2 days.
According to calculation, this disturbance can last about a week.
Papa, before now the two of us lived in two distant worlds and communicated little. But now our two worlds have merged into one. We are fighting for a common goal, and I am proud of that. Papa, like every one of your soldiers, I am waiting for your order. The Minister of Space said,
Everything Dr. McHale said is true. Last year we launched a probe toward the Sun. Based on calculations from the mathematical model, it carried out a small impact test on the solar surface and confirmed the disturbance predicted by the model. Dr. Zhuang and his research group have also proposed an idea. Perhaps in the future this method can be used to alter Earth's climate appropriately.
Marshal Levchenko walked into a small compartment and picked up the red telephone directly connected to the president. A short while later, he came back out. Historical accounts of that moment differ. Some say he spoke the sentence immediately. Others say he remained silent for a full minute. But the sentence is certain.
Tell Misha to do as he says. January 12th, near solar orbit.
Eternal snowstorm.
Rushes toward the sun. Eternal snowstorm opened all 10 of its nuclear fusion engines. From the nozzle of each engine, a plasma jet more than 100 kilometers long sprayed out as it made its final orbital and attitude corrections. Ahead of
eternal snowstorm
lay a huge and beautiful solar prominence, a stream of blazing hydrogen gas spiraling up from the sun's surface. It was like a long veil floating above the ocean of solar fire, changing shape and posture as if in a dream. Both ends were connected to the solar surface, forming an enormous arch.
Eternal snowstorm passed slowly and solemnly through the center of this triumphal arch, 400,000 kilometers high. Ahead appeared several more prominences, each attached to the sun at one end while the other stretched deep into space. The eternal snowstorm.
Its engines shining blue was like a tiny firefly passing among several great trees of flame. Later, the blue light gradually went out. The engines stopped.
Eternal snowstorm had set its orbit precisely. Everything remaining would be completed by the law of universal gravitation.
When the spacecraft entered the sun's upper atmosphere, the corona, the black background of space above, turned purple-red. That purple-red glow filled all space here. Below, the scene in the solar chromosphere could be clearly seen. There, thousands upon thousands of spicules glittered. Astronomers had observed such things as early as the 19th century. They were luminous gas jets shooting from the solar surface into the heights, making the solar atmosphere look like a burning prairie, every blade of grass thousands of kilometers long. Beneath this burning prairie lay the photosphere, an endless ocean of fire.
In the final images sent back from eternal snowstorm,
people saw Misha rise from before the huge monitor screen and press a button to open the protective cover outside the transparent dome. The magnificent ocean of fire appeared before him. He wanted to see with his own eyes the world of his childhood dreams. The sea of fire trembled and deformed. That was the half-meter thick insulating glass melting. Soon the glass wall, more than 100 meters high, turned into a transparent liquid and rolled down. Like a person first seeing the ocean and standing intoxicated before the sea wind, Misha spread his arms to welcome the 6,000-degree hurricane roaring toward him.
In the last few seconds of images sent back before the camera and transmitter melted, people could see Misha's body ignite. At last his whole body became a leaping torch and merged with the sun's sea of fire. What followed could only be imagined. Eternal snowstorms.
Solar panels and protruding structures would melt first. Because of surface tension, the molten parts would form silver droplets on the spacecraft's surface. When eternal snowstorm
crossed the boundary between chromosphere and corona, its main body would begin to melt. After it penetrated 2,000 kilometers into the chromosphere, the whole structure would be completely molten. Separate metal droplets would merge into one huge silver sphere of liquid, flying at high speed along the target line set by computers that had already turned to liquid. The effect of the solar atmosphere would begin to show. Around the liquid sphere, a ring of pale blue flame would appear, trailing hundreds of kilometers backward its color shifting from pale blue to yellow, and then, at the tail, to a beautiful orange red.
Finally, this beautiful fire phoenix vanished into the boundless sea of flame. January 13, Earth. Humanity returned to the world before Marconi. At night, even in equatorial regions, the sky was filled with surging auroras.
Facing television screens full of snow, most people could only guess and imagine what was happening across that vast land where the fierce battle raged. January 13, Moscow Front.
General Parker pushed away the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division and several frontline commanders who were trying to pull him onto a helicopter. He raised his binoculars and continued looking into the distance where the Russian line was rolling forward.
Range 4,000 meters. Ammunition number 9 loaded. Delay fuse. Fire. From the firing sounds behind him, Parker knew that fewer than 30 105mm howitzers could still shoot. They were the only heavy weapons he currently had for defense.
An hour earlier, the only armored force on this position, a German tank battalion, had launched a countercharge with admirable courage and achieved excellent results. 8 kilometers away, it had destroyed 1.5 times its own number of Russian tanks. But because of the absolute disadvantage in numbers, it vanished before the Russian torrent of steel-like dew beneath the noon sun.
Range 3,500 meters. Fire!
After the shells whistled through the air, a high wall of earth and flame rose before the Russian tank formation. But it was like a landslide before a flood. The collapsed earth temporarily blocked the flood, and in the end the flood still poured over it. After the soil thrown up by explosions fell back, the Russian armored spearhead appeared again in the dense smoke. Parker saw that their formation was extremely tight, as if on parade.
Using such a formation to attack in the previous days would have been suicide, but now, with NATO's air and long-range strike power almost completely paralyzed, it was a usable formation. It could concentrate armored assault power to the maximum and ensure a breakthrough at one point on the front.
The mistake in the defensive layout was exactly what General Parker had expected, because under these battlefield electromagnetic conditions, it was almost impossible to determine the enemy's main attack direction accurately and quickly. His mind was blank about the next phase of defense. With the C3I system fully paralyzed, rapidly adjusting the defensive deployment was extremely difficult.
Range 3,000 meters. Fire! General, were you looking for me?
Lieutenant General Josquet, commander of the French forces, came over. Beside him were only a French lieutenant colonel and a helicopter pilot. He wore no camouflage. The ribbons on his chest and the stars on his shoulders were polished bright. But he wore a helmet and carried a rifle, making him look incongruous.
I hear that on our left flank, the Fawn Division is withdrawing from its position. Yes, General. General Josquet, behind us, 700,000 NATO troops are retreating. Their successful breakout depends on our firm defense. It depends on your firm defense.
May I have a clearer explanation? You understand everything. You concealed the real battle situation from us. You knew long ago that the right-wing alliance forces were going to declare a unilateral ceasefire on the Eastern Front.
As Supreme Commander of NATO forces, I have the right to do so. General, I think you also understand that you and your troops have a duty to obey command. Range 2,500 meters, fire.
I obey only the orders of the President of the French Republic.
I do not believe you can receive such orders now. I received them months ago at the National Day reception in the Élysée Palace. The President personally explained to me how French forces should act under such circumstances. You Gaullist bastards, you have not changed in all these decades.
Parker finally lost control. Do not make it sound so ugly, General. If you do not leave, I will stay alone too. Together we will die gloriously in battle on this vast snow field. Napoleon also failed here. We will not be ashamed, Josquet said, waving the famous standard French rifle at Parker.
Range 2,000 meters. Fire! Parker slowly turned around to face the group of frontline commanders before him.
Please pass the following words to the American troops holding their positions. We were not born as an army that can fight only by computer. We came from an army of farmers. Decades ago, on Guadalcanal, we fought the Japanese for one jungle hole after another. At Khe Sanh, we used shovels to knock away North Vietnamese grenades. Farther back, on that cold winter night, Great Washington led soldiers without shoes across the frozen Delaware at Trenton and made history.
Range 1,500 meters. Fire! I order all documents and non-combat baggage destroyed. Range 1,200 meters. Fire!
General Parker put on his helmet and body armor and tucked his 9mm pistol under his left arm. At that moment, the howitzers fell silent. The gunners were loading hand grenades into the barrels. A burst of disorderly explosions followed. All soldiers.
General Parker said, looking at the Russian tank group now spread before them like a barrier of death. Fix bayonets! Behind the battlefield smoke, the sun appeared and disappeared, casting shifting light and shadow over the blood-soaked snowfield.
Note 1. The electronic warfare terms are briefly explained as follows. Frequency hopping. Transmitter and receiver change frequencies in the same sequence. Direct sequence spread spectrum. Signal energy is spread across a wide frequency band, making interception and jamming more difficult. Null steering adaptive antenna. An antenna with a coverage pattern somewhat like a kidney, with the notch aimed at an enemy jammer, to which the antenna gives no response, allowing communication with friendly antennas in other directions. Burst. Sending information for a short time over a wide band, or for a long time over a very narrow band. Frequency agility. Changing frequency automatically under jamming.
Note 2. In 1966, General de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command, a serious blow to NATO during the Cold War.